Hello. Namaste, motherfuckers. Brothers and sisters and all sorts of non-binary hipsters. Welcome to another terrifying installment of When Uncles Go Bad. Tonight, I thought we'd talk about myth. I'm interested in myth. I'm interested in the stories that we tell ourselves. And so should you be. When we first started to talk to one another, there was something that's much more than just like, I was down by the river, fucking crocodile tried to eat your face off. There's much more to it than that. We tell ourselves stories. We tell ourselves stories about meta narratives, of things that are much, much bigger than us. We tell ourselves stories that help us to understand who we are, to find our place in the world, and then to convey that meaning to other generations. So one of the oldest ones, I think, is the Epic of Gilgamesh, which I read some time ago, and I can't particularly remember it, if I'm honest, but it was about this dude called Gilgamesh. Right now, it's a hero's journey. Okay, so you read Joseph Campbell as a go-to for all things myth. His story, the power, his book, the story of myth, the power of myth, is a wonderful study in how mythology works in the human psyche and what it does. And he was really interested in particularly what he would call the hero's journey. So there's this arc of I think we said it before in days gone past, it's a very sort of masculine word. It's very much about dominating and controlling our environment, and that's something which has been much more of a sort of aggressive. So it's fallen into that side of the sort of masculine, right or wrong. It's kind of where it is. Fucking hell, it's hot tonight, isn't it? So I will be sweating like a rapist, and I apologise because that joke is so insensitive. But you know, we wouldn't be here if he was on about sensitive, would we? So the whole hero's journey thing, it's kind of about where we come from in our way that we develop from child into man. I must remember to look like direct address. I keep forgetting to do that, and I'm not quite as intimidating as when I'm looking over there, so I'll try the intimidating bit a little bit more. The hero's journey is about our development from boy to man, and we must overcome some obstacles, some hurdles in the way. I mean, quite often you've got a large beast to slay. Now, in evolution, we have a conflict and a combat with lots of large beasts. So that could be anything that's attempting to eat us, or it could be something environmental like a tidal wave or an avalanche or earthquakes, anything that's sort of larger on the landscape than we are, that threatens our survival and threatens our very being. So they become sort of played out symbolically in stories, in tales, in myths. They become dragons that need to be slain, 8-headed mother-in-laws, whatever it is that needs to be overcome before you can control the environment and go from boy to man. So the hero's journey we see coming up in a lot. Let's say the Epic of Gilgamesh is one of those, and it's that laid the foundations of. It's one of the oldest written texts, I believe, that we've still got. Mesopotamian, Middle East. So that sort of lays the groundwork for this idea that you've got a journey, a physical journey from one part to another, usually going up. I'm pretty sure it went up into a mountain. So there is an ascension theme that goes on, and there is definitely a combat with some beast, something that's bigger than ourselves, and then that plays out the going from boy to man. But I mean, it's so much more than just a puberty tale. It really is about our journey from relative helplessness as babies and children. I mean, with it, of all the species, we're the ones that we take. It's comparable. I mean, elephants are in the womb for like 5 years or something daft like that. I'm pretty sure. Research it. Let me know. Don't let me know. I don't give a fuck. It's comparative to the size of us, but we're the longest species it takes from birth to physical independence. It takes us fucking ages to get off of the tee. It takes us fucking ages to get on our feet. And there's something in that about the species, potentially because it takes us all that time to carry around these big fucking brains so we can tell stories. So our stories, of course, our stories are going to somehow encapsulate that terrific journey we've got from complete dependence and babies are cute, but pretty fucking useless. Let's face it. You can't give one a job, can you? You can't race the fucking things. They are so dependent on us and so vulnerable and so fragile. And then we turn from that into something which commands its environment. It doesn't necessarily dictate how the weather goes, but can control the environments, control how the weather is affecting them in such a way that the animals probably could not. Yeah, things look for shelter, but don't fucking build shelters, do they? You know what I mean? Lions and tigers and bears are all fucking wonderful things, but there is not one of them that has built an Asda's. Not one of them. Lazy fucking animals, not one of them has built a Costa. Nothing, absolutely nothing. You might see them go down to the water and hang around like a kind of thing that they do socially. Not fucking one of them has got a club card. No, not one. Lazy motherfuckers. So they haven't got these stories because they hit the ground running. And we don't. So it takes us that time to sort of arc that. So I'm thinking that's perhaps where some of those myths come from. And of course, we can see those played large in like Homer's Odyssey and the Iliad. Those great Greek. They were Greek, weren't they? Were they? I don't know. Talk to myself and ask myself, why not? I'm pretty sure they were Greek, okay, but they're classics, aren't they? And that's very much on the same sort of vein as that hero's journey. So you start as something not complete, an incomplete human, vulnerable, at the mercy of the gods, if you like, but at the mercy of their environment. And then they travel through space. There is actual movement there, and they come up against some sort of conflict, and it's in the guise of a big fucked off. Oh gosh, what was it in? I've not read it, so I am paraphrasing. But there is a conflict, right? So it's either a monster, or it's a large army, or something like that. But it's something much bigger than one person. It's more than just I have to face my own demons. It's played large. Okay, so we see it played through that, and of course in sort of Anglo-Saxon Celtic, certainly where we would experience our own myths from. You've got the Arthurian Arthur legends. The boy that takes the sword from the stones, and somehow he's imbued with this mythical myth. Is imbued with this otherworldly level of power, and with that power comes great responsibility, and so he has to go forth into the world and conquer invading enemies and conquer environments, and then to become the regal lord of the land. So there's this journey all the way through, and let's say it's quite often. It's almost always a physical journey through space. We can't get away from things being through time, because that's how we're limited to experience in our 3 dimensions. But it's much more than that. It tells us something about the journey that we have to go through from vulnerable child into adult, into adolescence, and the obstacles that we need to overcome in the way. And that's played large. Because that's what we do, isn't it? If I come in and I helped an old lady across the road, I'll tell the first person I helped an old lady across the road, and then I helped the old lady across the road because she looked like she'd been hit in the head with a fucking tennis ball. And then by the time I've told the 20th person, I've literally rescued virgins from a sinking boat wearing nothing but Marmite. We embellish things, we build things up. We're all natural storytellers in that sense. So that's kind of where we go with that thing when we tell stories to one another. We do that because we like to communicate. We do that because we like to engage. We do that because we like to entertain one another. And why do we like to entertain one another? We have a sense that we're much more than what we are. We have a sense that we're much more than just this flesh and bone, eating, sleeping, shit, and fucking. There must be a purpose to us. So we put that purpose in our stories. We build into it extra layers of meaning that give us more to live for, more to live by. And these stories become really important in how we mediate that to one another. And there's lots of different examples other than just the hero's journey. That's Campbell's, Joseph Campbell's take on it, which is that's an absolutely fascinating read. Another one is I can't think of his name, but he wrote The Golden Bough. His name will come to me at some point, obviously, once I finish this, where it's no use to anyone. But The Golden Bough, that's another one that sort of deals with myths and stories. So we've got like folklore as well. So things like, which is so politically incorrect, the old wives' tales that we tell each other that often have some root in something that's realistic. I mean, one old wives' tale that I don't think I was necessarily brought up with. It wasn't like, I'm old, but I'm not that fucking old. But a hangover from previous generations was chew bark, chew a bit of tree to alleviate headaches. Now aspirin was it was either derived from it, or they found similarities to do for aspirin, the painkiller, in the willow bark. So there was some truth in the old wives' tale, you know. Of course, an old wives' tale just points to something which is an oral tradition, which explains where we are with things, but it doesn't really have any basis in science. And you know, we're such. I'm at pains lately to go and use social media because of the fucking backlash that there is from people that believe one way or believe another way. And like, on either side of any debate, because it is polarized and it is black or white, on or off. There's no discursive bit in the middle where we actually respect one another enough. Both sides will throw science at each other as though science is an absolute. You know, it's science or it's numbers, so that can't be wrong and it can't lie. Well, you know, we've seen it a million times where science is revised because we found out that something didn't last for 1,000,000 years; it lasted for 1,000,004. You know, so we had to revise that because we were fucking wrong. You know, the vaccines is a big one. You know, I'm not throwing my own political views on there at all, but we can be wrong over these science things. Thalidomide was one that was given to pregnant women, and it caused real deformities and abnormalities in the babies that were born. You know, loss of limbs. There was sort of short hand where there should have been an arm. It's quite recognisable when you see it. You know, it's not taking away from the people that experience that and go through with that, and that's how they were born with those abnormalities, sort of atypical physical structures, because they're humans just like the rest of us. But I think, you know, given the choice, they would not have had that chemical that caused that to happen if they could have avoided it, I'm sure. And that's something as a society we've got to look to do, isn't it? Surely have such surety in the things that we put in our bodies that there isn't a knock-on effect which is really detrimental. And I think that's something to around the vaccines at the moment, which is an issue. I think there's a lack of trust or an unbelievable amount of trust invested in it. But like I say, both sides are using science as though it has some sort of absolute, some sort of real certainty to it. But science is revised. You know, science is contested. Science is wrong. So it's not necessarily hasn't necessarily got the capital on truth that we tend to put into it in society. You know, and that, you know, science has certainly overtaken myth in how we communicate the world to one another in the West. I think, you know, without wanting to offend anybody, as we're talking about storytelling, I think you have to take some of the biblical stories as myth. You have to take Christendom. So, you know, particularly in the UK where we are now, unless you're watching it from somewhere else, in which case I'm sure your part of the world is just as fucked up as ours at the moment. And hello. Christendom kind of dictated to us what our laws and morals were for quite some time. And it still has some influence on what people, you know, especially people certainly certainly start quoting scripture when they want to be anti-migrant and things like that. Suddenly a Christian country. Then, I'm not sure Jesus would share the same sort of fervour against anti-migration. Bearing in mind that he was moving around quite so much himself, he was not keen on borders. Anyhow, I digress. Kind of do that all the time. That's the nature of Gonzo. We don't fucking go down one line. Hopefully, we meet ourselves coming back. So Christendom kind of determined how we thought about things in the West, certainly in the UK. But it's made up of stories. There's no science in that. There's no maths in that. Actually, in the Old Testament, there's loads of fucking maths. It's really confusing. But they're tales that we tell one another, and then eventually they got written down, and they go from an oral tradition to a written tradition that we pass on. But reading and writing's only been around for a couple of 100 years, and certainly not for plebs like myself. A couple of centuries ago, I wouldn't have been fucking reading. Be lucky to have lived it. Well, I'm lucky to have lived this long anyhow. But even shorter lifespan back then, bearing in mind that I come from a low socio-economic background, I would have been covered in shit and I would have died of cholera. So there's that, which is positive. Got every cloud. So our stories that came through from Christendom don't have much of a basis in fact. They don't have much of a basis in a certifiable history. There's a lot of elements we go, right, we can cross-reference it and say that actually happened. This is similar to something that happened here. So there is some historical value to it anyhow, but not all. And I think the things that we find in Christian myths are the stories that have moral tales to tell us. So there was the one where the little boy leaves his town and he's swallowed by a whale, and then the guy that invented him finds himself in the whale. He's called Geppetto, and then he was a real boy. That's Pinocchio. There was something similar, Jonah, in the fucking belly of a whale. There was a moral story to it. Don't try to fuck fish, or something along those lines. But there's moral tales to all of these things. Like Job, the book of Job, that's one of the really hard ones to read. That it's just like, dude, why are you putting up with all this shit? Well, because I believe that God has got a plan for me. Like, dude, you are putting up with some shit, man. It keeps challenging me. It's like, no, I've got it. And it's a real strong tale in having faith. And is it can we measure it? Is it quantifiable? No. Is it historically accurate? Can we find out whether it really happened or not? No, of course we fucking can't. But there's something in there that travels through time and travels through cultures that gives us something. It gives us a testament to, in that instance, the strength of faith. Look at the state of that. Look at me sweating under my tits. I am a keeper. Get in there. I told you it was hot. And I've got lights as well, so you can see us. I don't know whether, I think perhaps I looked better in the dark. Answers on a postcard. I can't think of any. Adam and Eve. There we go. There's one that we can't say that is historically accurate. Okay, I'm just going to go out on a limb there and say that. We can't say that it is, in terms of evolution, also one which has much grounding in a scientific approach to how humans got to be where they are. But it does give us a real moral framework about shame. Once Adam and Eve became embarrassed, became guilt-ridden, or shamed, embarrassed that they had no clothes on, that they were just flesh in the eyes of God, they had this false pride that they became embarrassed and ashamed of their bodies, which of course was not how we are meant to be. We are meant to be built in the image of, which I think was much more built to look like. I think it was much more built in the nature and the flavor of it. I think more so it was logos, wasn't it, which is not necessarily in the word of God or in the image of God. It's more like a logo would be a brand identity. So in the image of God was more in flavour of, in the theme of, in the feel and the mood and the expression of, rather than just looking like. So of course, and that makes sense, because when Adam and Eve go, oh fucking hell, I've got to cover myself up, dude in the sky's looking. That's not how God intended. So there's a clear story there which transcends time, with it being retold, because it's still read today. That has something to do with not necessarily taking pride in ourselves, but being accepting of what we are, accepting of who we are, and accepting of what God intended us to be. And then when we rally against that, it causes some conflict. And of course, there was the eating of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which I always think is a wonderful title for a tree. Not speak, spruce, it's quite boring. Oak, quite boring. Knowledge of good and evil, fucking what a title. So that was about having overstepped the mark and becoming your own gods, becoming better than creation itself. So it's not necessarily a moral or a myth with a parable in there about with a myth with a moral narrative in there to make us think that we can't be in control of our own destiny, but we shouldn't overstep the mark and think that we are our own gods. So there's that sort of set of beliefs that are in there, and so they travel through. And as you go further down, obviously those stories and the flood and things like that, Sodom and Gomorrah, we become too hedonistic, so we said that we smoke the fuck out of people. All of those clear myths, quite obvious tall tales, are told in a way to help us to understand what is good and what is bad. So they got that function through time. And later on, we get I'm much more drawn to and appreciative of the Gospels, which deal with the teachings and the travels of Jesus. And again, I think that's a really, really key point to the Gospels, is that cunt never stops moving. I think that's really, really important, and not many people talk about that. It's something that I've formulated in myself. There's that constant motion through Jesus's life in all four of the Gospels, where he doesn't sit still. There's punctuated points where he stops and has his feet cleaned and has a shandy at a well, and there's moments where he does stop, granted, but never to sort of take root anywhere. There's always this travel through space, travel through other people's environments, travel through other people's cultures, that I think is really, really fundamental to the Gospels. In that we're living in a process, we're living in something which is never complete. And I think the idea of God become man needs to necessarily be timeless, needs to be something which is not just culturally specific, but it happens always, forever, in all of us. And I think that's something about the journey that does that, as well as what we were always saying about the hero's journey as well, that travel through a life cycle. I think it's something more necessary in the four Gospels that does that sort of thing. But Jesus talks in parables all of the time, so he uses things, stories, when he could tell someone something directly. And I can't think off the top of my head any decent ones to use as an example at the moment. No, I really can't. My apologies. Go and read it. It's available everywhere at your local bookstore. Go to it when everything opens up. Go and pull one out of the drawer of many hotels and get them for free and read it yourself, because it is fucking interesting. But he tells these parables all the time. And now, arguably, we've got the greatest teachers to ever live, and that's what all the whole Jesus thing is certainly about. God become man to impart wisdom, to help you to move in the right direction in life, and to bring about heaven on earth. So it doesn't give you any clear-cut fucking ideas in terms of a leader, in terms of management. It looks quite shoddy, we turned up at 9 and you gave us a fucking riddle, and we didn't really know what to do, so we bunked off early and had an extended tea break, and now it's lunchtime, we've got no work done. Wouldn't on face value look like the best leader. But what we're left with in those parables is multiple layers of meaning that we have to then think about and unpack, and that's something that story does for us that a command or a set of instructions can never do. That's a real cold use of language. Where we could do that, we could point, we could give a show an example and ask for it to be replicated. But a story asks of us to explore and to navigate and to test whether those ideas are really there, to test whether our relationship with those ideas are worth having, and whether we can learn something from those, whether we can reflect on ourselves to develop a tool. A story invites us to do that, whereas instruction just doesn't. So look, on face value, it looks like the guy's a really shit teacher. When it comes down to it, his fucking things have lasted 2,000 years. Not that I can remember any of them, so that's a really bad example. But you have put me on the spot, me. So don't do that again to me. They're worth looking at. Stories that are told in the Bible are certainly worth looking at, as are many other stories. But this is what I was trying to say about how our culture is sort of built around those. So, as well as parables and I'm putting these all loosely under the idea of myth, because stories can be made up on the fly, and they're like clearly something that's made up, clearly something that is imagined and narrative, whereas myth has some germ of truth in it. There's something that gave rise to that story being developed and then being carried through ages and across times and spaces and generations. So there's always sort of some nugget of truth in there. So let's go to the myth. Let's talk about the myths like the Loch Ness Monster and Bigfoot. And then in later times, you've got things like Slender Man, which is a very modern sort of urban legend, are modern myths. Now, for me, people think I'm fucking nuts for a lot of reasons. But one of the reasons that people sort of really criticize my thinking is I feel that there is a possibility in the potential of a bipedal hominid being able to survive, coexist with us, and not be identified and, in a sense, caught by civilization in our time. I do. I think that the potential for Bigfoot existing is a very real potential. Okay. I am mad. Yeah, I am. I take lots of medication. I've got a certificate to say that I'm fucking mental. I think that there's a potential for that to be true. Okay. And to explain that away, I think that we live in a fantastically huge world, and we don't understand how big that is. There are places in the world that have never had a human footfall, and I think that's mental. We come from the UK. Our UK is really tiny. Do you know what I mean? That's why films like The Blair Witch never really works in the UK like they did across the pond. Because if you get lost in the woods in England, after 20 minutes, you find a fucking a little chef, shell garage. You're not never lost for long. You get lost in the States, and you may never come back. So I think in those sets of circumstances, certainly the Blair Witch Project could work a lot better like that. And that's a story around stories of town folk tales that are kept alive. So that gives a potential for Bigfoot to be possible or plausible. So that's where I am with that. Now, why do we do that? Well, I think we tell ourselves stories of ghosts and ghoulies and goblins and monsters because they help us, don't they? They help us to stay out of the woods where we could get lost. They help us to, not go into the water too deep because the Leviathan will bite our faces off, Mermaids is an interesting one. I think mermaids has something to do with temporary psychosis caused by being out at sea for some amount of time. And how we can get when we're dehydrated, which I'm getting now because it's really fucking hot. So my apologies, I'm sweating all over the place. So my apologies for that. I won't get undressed because there's a court order that says that I can't. at the moment. So the mermaid one's a different one, but I think there's a a cautionary tale, as in you don't get too tied up on what you think you might see on land. You need to keep your shit together, because otherwise you're going to veer into the rocks while you're busy seeing the mirage. Similar sort of thing. We see we see a watering hole where there's not, because we're out of the desert for so long. So interestingly, the sea version of mirage is like sexy fish woman, which is quite cool. If you're into that sort of thing, and I always thought Ariel would get it. So we have stories of monsters that become myth, partly as cautionary tales. Don't go into the woods, a witch will bite your fingers. Don't climb over that fence, there's a werewolf there that will have your fucking shoes away. They prevent us from doing things that we know that are unsafe for us to do. So there's that as an element to why we carry these stories down, why we take them to us. But for me, there's much more that thing about making meaning. So my favourite word is pareidolia or pareidolia. Favourite word, don't know how to fucking say it. But that's seeing human characteristics in places where they aren't necessarily there. So seeing faces. When we look up at the clouds, we go, oh look, it's James L. Jones in The Lion King, sounding like Darth Vader. How peculiar. We look at a tree and then we see the face of a dead grandmother that we wished had not died quite so early in our lives and had been there to hold us in our more challenging times. So we can see things and we make of them. We lay our own meaning over them. It's not a set of data that's coming from a place into us. We are transposing our data on top of it and making it look like a certain thing. Now, there is a reason for doing that. Yeah. So if we're looking out in the woods, evolutionary biology shit that we're going back to here, if we are not knowing what the fuck that is that's making that noise over there, if we think to ourselves that is another human and start to believe in it in those sorts of ways, then we can start to work on our fight, flight, freeze, shit ourselves by curry responses and deal with it accordingly and not be eaten by another human. So there is a reason for us layering those images over us, because of course everything down from that is okay. If it's not animal, human animal, it's a plant that just looks like a little bit like Jeremy Beadle, then it's not so threatening. But we go from that high place and down to it. So there's a reason that we do that. And part of it is we just like fucking meaning. Part of it is we're so egocentric that everything's got to look like a fucking human, because nothing else would be plausible. And that's the interesting stuff with aliens, isn't it? Which is another sort of modern myth that we've got, until it's proven or disproven. A modern myth that we've got where we anthropomorphize them, we make human of them. So different from pareidolia, where we get it wrong and we transpose that meaning on it. We don't know what they are right from the off, so we believe that they must be something like us. If something is truly alien, then it might exist in a form that we cannot fucking understand. Even something that a sentient gas is something that would be very difficult to understand. If we're talking about loads of different dimensions, how do we even begin to imagine what that would be if we haven't got the words or able to visualize those things? How do we say what alien is if it's so fucking alien that we can't understand it? Yeah, but we don't. We go, it looks a little bit like us, but not quite so pretty, because that's what we do as we're humans, because we're so egocentric. We put that onto ourselves. But yeah, so those myths are there, and we see things that are very similar to us, and we make them similar to us. And they work as sort of cautionary tales, and I say they work to control the mystery a little bit, So when we look into a deep cavern and we hear some fucking noises and we are proper scared, if we say it's a monster, well, the reality of it is no less scary, but because we've put a label on the monster, we then can come up in our head with solutions on how to kill the monster, solutions on how to control the monster. Okay, so just that labeling of itself gives us a little bit of something like a purchase on the fear, on the threat. So I think that's some of the reasons why we have monsters in our world, And another thing is because it's really fucking difficult to deal with monsters. I think Colin Wilson done some work on what he would call the X factor. He done some work on the occult or freaky shit. And his book, which I believe is called The Occult, it's a fucking fascinating read. It'll take you a while. It's a big tome of a book, but it's a fascinating read. He talks about lycanthropy in there, which is werewolves. Now, so you've got a very sort of mythological character there that could potentially have some relationship with real occurrences. Now he posits the idea, and whether you believe in this or not, I just quite like the idea and think it's possible for what humans do, that he was suggesting that possibly reports of werewolves have happened on the back of rape, of sexual assault, suggesting that the situation itself is so horrific that rather than accept the reality of the circumstance, rather than accept that there is a human person that you probably know that is doing the most unspeakable things to you, you dissociate a certain degree from that and move to the next sort of logical thing. So rather than it being a human that's acting monstrous, it is a monster, which is fascinating, because there's a load of precedent for dissociative moments in times of real trauma. I love Twin Peaks. I was a huge fan of Twin Peaks, you know, when it first came out in the early 90s, and the whole thing sort of centered around this dissociative episode that the victim of the whole story, Laura Palmer, had. I mean, you know, and there was a spiritual or a mysterious and metaphysical approach and elements to that. But I think in a very sort of cold light of day, what you've seen is somebody who was sexually abused by their father. So they create a demon figure to help to manage that sort of stuff, you know. And if you look at psychology, it's quite a common thing to imagine something other, because the acceptance of the reality is so difficult, and I can kind of understand that. So you've got the argument there that myth is built from something that was real and unspeakable, and because of the nature of it being unspeakable, it had to be put in terms that could be spoken about. So rather than you know, because of course, if you've been raped, then you are no use to anyone. You've lost your value in your community, because you're made dirty and you can no longer be respected, and all of those things that come into it. So a real sort of unspeakable circumstance to find yourself, and it would then become much easier to have a real monster doing those things, and you becoming a full-on victim to that. And certainly vampirism has got this similar sort of air to it, where there was the seductive element, and certainly the teeth as a penetrative visual metaphor for the penetration of sex. So, well, you know, whether you want to read Colin Wilson stuff like that or not, it's just interesting to think, how did these myths develop, and what is their purpose, what is their function, what do they do for us? So yeah, you got myths that turn, in that sense, they sort of turn into folklore that starts to explain things that could potentially be phenomenological, things that are outside of the human experience, a bit weird. So we attribute a much more creative set of circumstances for them to exist within. So we jump to the idea of witches, we jump to the idea of vampires, because some of the other things are really difficult to do. Like, you know, a series of bad luck. I mean, particularly around things like crops failing. That was something that always why would we not have any food for our whole community for this year? What is the reason for that? What has happened to make God hate us so much to stop that from happening? Because we have to put meaning of it. We have to make meaning of things which are quite often in this universe meaningless. So when we do that, we maybe jump to a conclusion which seems ludicrous to us in our day of science and reason and explaining things in a very sort of materialistic way, very knock on wood kind of fucking solid way. But in other times we haven't had that, so we've created something to make to make sense of those things when there isn't any sense. And I mentioned Slender Man. That was something that became like an urban legend, a few years ago now. But these stories that we tell ourselves to creep each other out, because that's another element of why we tell stories, is that entertainment of it. So you've got the function as in, don't go down there because you'll get you're treated badly, so don't do that. And there's that cautionary sort of element to it. There is the element that it's helping us to understand our position in the world and the relationship that we've got with a universe which is much bigger than us, and how we must develop and adapt to that or learn to control it. So there's that hero's journey arc that we talk about, but there's also an element where we just fucking like freaking each other out. We wouldn't go on roller coasters if we didn't like that shit feeling, and in an age where we don't have bears to run from often, we don't have reasons to test our fight or flight responses anymore. We are and there is an argument to this as to why crime rates are so high in areas where national service has been abolished. And I don't know where I stand on those things, but there is something definitely about untapped energy at a time of burgeoning adolescence, where if it was channeled in the right way, boxing, for example. Boxing is a wonderful way of channeling that energy at a young age, that then it doesn't get misspent in areas where anger could then take over as the way of exploring and expressing an energy which is in deep. Certainly that's where a lot of the feminine energy around the time of puberty and the first sort of menstruation. There is a lot of horror. Carrie was the most famous one, but a lot of horror writing that expresses that almost you tap into like telepathy and telekinesis and all these phenomenological things outside of our normal human experience, which are triggered by that first menstrual cycle. The big changes in our life trigger things which need some bigger explanation for them outside of ourselves. So certainly they function to do a lot of things, but they can also function as tales which we fucking enjoy. We get a thrill off of that. Now that we haven't got those things to run away from, to fight, now that we've got a world which is essentially, it mollycoddles us in the West, so we don't have to explore those things in the physical world, so we can explore them in the storytelling realm. So we do tend to tell ourselves these folklores, our wives' tales, these narratives, and that's when things like horror movies and horror stories become really big. Not just on the screen, we tell them to ourselves in real life as well, and they become things like urban legends, and there will always be the freaky woman at the end of the street that no one particularly understands, so therefore she's a witch. There will always be that time when I spoke to myself in the mirror and I spoke back. I'm presuming everyone does that, yeah. So we take symbols which are quite totemic. They become totems of belief throughout all cultures and times. So things like mirrors, things like reflections, things like cups, something that holds things in. There's all these little symbolic things that travel through times and through cultures that mean or don't mean stuff to us, that we can then subvert and tell ourselves stories to give ourselves a bit of a kick from. The mirror is one particularly like that. So if we look into it and say something fucking terrible happens, freaky person at the end of the street, obviously casting spells on us and making our crops go fucked. So we've got those senses to it, and I think we tell ourselves these stories for lots and lots of different reasons. They give us a sense of who we are. They help us to navigate who we are when we're bringing other people into the world. And they're shorthand. Rather than sort of having to explain everything, a myth will give us a set of truisms, you know, the sort of nugget or germ of something wholly acceptable in there, that then gives rise to a much more creative narrative. But in that, it will give us a lot of lessons that actually guiding somebody through the world would take a much longer time to give, you know, to employ and to develop in them. One of the interesting uses of myth that I like in the modern times is how we build up our legends. So Russell Brand does a really good live show called The Messiah Complex that does some very, very interesting things around the idea of legends and how we kind of cherry pick the good stuff and leave out all the bad stuff for the people that we want to believe in, because we want to believe in them as symbols, as icons that generate certain ideas, but then present these ideas in a way that's very easily accessible. You don't have to really get in there and study someone. They're iconic. They transfer and communicate those ideas to society very, very quickly without having to sort of unpack those. And one of those I find really interesting is it's Winston Churchill. Now I'm not a fan of Winston Churchill at all. I happen to think the guy was you know, racist. He didn't ever give up the idea of empire. Was quite happy to invade places and kill people of another colour. You know, all values I don't particularly share. You know, so there was a complex man, because he said some very, very interesting things, like a lie will get round the world before the truth has had time to put its trousers on. Those sorts of things. So he understood the world in a way that was very much of his time, or before his time, perhaps. And maybe one of the reasons why he was led, or why we've allowed him to become such an iconic leader figure. Quotes like that show that he's got a real sort of insight into how things work. My reason for bringing him into this is he's a very, very complex character. And I think the reasons that he's celebrated are not actually that complex. I think it was that the staunch, resolute leader that, you know, took on Nazi Germany single-handed and won for all of our freedoms. And it's somebody that we can hark back to talk about our own sense of national pride, our own ideas that we see in ourselves to be you know, confident and self-assured and willing to have the courage to stand up for our sets of beliefs, and talks as well about a traditional set of values that we perhaps fear that we're losing. So I think that Churchill is quite an interesting modern legend. The stories that are built up around him become mythological in their scope. He was a man. He had flaws. I think he was probably pissed off at the time that he was doing this thing. I'm pretty sure that somebody said he was an alcoholic, and I know loads of other flaws as well. But we strip all those away because they're not important to the story that we're telling. The story that we're telling is somebody with courage, that's a good leader, that wouldn't back down, that was insightful. And I think, I don't know where the quote comes from, but it was a lovely one about if there is difference between, I think it was so Randolph Hearst, the media tycoon. I'd have to check, or somebody else can check answers on a postcard. It's become a bit of a fucking theme, and it's loads of shit I don't know. If there is a toss up between printing the truth and print the legend, print the legend. Because the truth is dirty, it's messy, it's got loads of different avenues to go down, it's not tied up and it's not neat, whereas a legend is iconic, and a legend serves us in a way that the truth never actually could. You know, the truth is multi-dimensional, multi-layered, and there's good things and bad things. Whereas a legend is just pure message. So Churchill becomes a really, really interesting modern mythological creature for us, a mythological person for us, as it gives us some sense of strength in what we do. Like I say, not one that I particularly as a go-to of mine. I don't share the same sort of values. I suppose a comparable figure in that sense would be Nelson Mandela. So I've got his prisoner number tattooed on me, because when he died, I thought I had to mark it. It was a hero, a legend of mine. I had to mark it in some way, and that was just much more affordable than a portrait. But I like the idea. I like the idea that he was this. He was a terrorist. Through the course of time, he becomes an ambassador for peace, an ambassador for reconciliation, rather than violent opposition and dissent. So there is that transformative element to his character that I really buy into. But the way that he's presented is that gentle old man who was able to broker peace between people, and not the not the violent young man that was willing to be involved in an arms struggle. Much more problematic than the legend he becomes. But as I say, it's a comparable one. It's just that mine perhaps is less traditional and conservative and right. It's more modern and liberal and progressive. But they're comparable legends, because neither of those really have got much basis in the truth of the men that they talk about, but they have become modern myths that we pin our hopes on, that we project an idea of ourselves onto them, in the hope that we can be a little bit better than ourselves or at the moment. And I think that's what we do with myth. That's what we do with the stories that we tell ourselves. That's what we allow it to teach us where the fuck we are. We allow it to communicate that to our next generations, to communicate that to ourselves, to make some sense. And it gives us some framework to have some hope to work towards. And that's why we tell ourselves these stories. We tell ourselves these stories because we need something more than just eating and sleeping and shitting and fucking. We need there to be a depth and a breadth to our human experience, something more than this. And that's why I'm being so profound and looking straight at that little light, which I believe is a camera. So it looks as though I'm looking straight into your soul when I'm giving you this deep and meaningful rendition of what the whole thing was about. This summary of my entire ramblings tonight comes down to this one moment, and I am trying to start my own myth. Cults are a fucking same sort of thing. They tell a story, in much way that sort of other religions do. We tell ourselves these stories so we can make sense of the world in which we find ourselves, which is fucking confusing. We tell ourselves these stories so we can have hope in a future. We tell ourselves these stories and make these myths of people so we can have something to pin our hopes on, which is more than what we are in this moment. Well, I hope you've enjoyed it tonight, or endured it. I hope you sat there and fucking suffered for as long as I have. I hope you've enjoyed it. It is an interest. I could talk for fucking weeks and weeks about myth, and there's loads of stuff that I've missed. I do think it's fascinating. I really do. So many religious areas I didn't touch on at all. I mean, I'm very keen on some of the Hindu stories, and there's fantastic colours and adventures that happen all through those. I think one of the things about sort of myths and legends and folklores and fairy tales is that there is quite often archetypes and stereotypes that run through their prop. I wouldn't say Vladimir, but I don't think it's Prop who had the work on archetypes in. So there was like 12 different types of person in a story. So that you had, obviously clearly hero, villain, but you had a fool and an entertainer. You had like a usurper, somebody that was sort of two-faced, So all these different areas and different hierarchies of people that, of course, relate to our own human experience, and those archetypes are found in almost every story in almost every culture. So they must talk about something which is innate in us as humans, in terms of characteristics, in terms of what we see in others and characteristics. So yeah, proper belief in archetypes. So that's interesting that we find different things, different themes, and different types of person in all stories, in all times, in all cultures. So it must be communicating something about our deeper sense of ourselves. So yeah, there's loads and loads that you can talk about with myths, and that's sort of the mythological stuff, the cryptids. I grew up loving the idea of the Loch Ness monster. I really did. Now, interestingly, as not necessarily an aside, but as a comparative to that, I have a real irrational fear of sharks. You don't get many sharks in the shower. You don't even have a bath. It affected my ability to learn to swim because I could never go in past my balls. And to be fair, most relationships I've ever been, I've always stopped at the balls because of a fear of sharks. Not necessarily with relationships, that's more of a fear of commitment, but a fear of sharks meant that I could not go in past where I could see, past where I could control, and that's the key thing, because of a monster and a threat from underneath. So curiously, I suppose I had this fascination with the Loch Ness monster, which is exactly that. It's something larger than life, beyond our experience, beyond our ability to explain, and it is fantastical, and as well as monstrous. It's the stuff of dreams and the stuff of nightmares, but it rises from above, and there is something thematic with that. But interestingly, because I've had this fear of something which is very much real and provable. So yeah, we could talk about cryptids. The potential for other things to be living and not classified, until we're blue in the tooth, long in the face, until the biscuit falls off at both ends. There's a saying there. And I apologize if I've freaked you out with the Bigfoot stuff, but I really am fucking keen on that. There was a type of chimpanzee that was identified only a decade or so ago, not very long, maybe even less. Now that it's a slightly different type of chimpanzee to the chimpanzees in the neighbouring areas, it's got a longer fucking toenail or something. It's just ever so slightly different, but we didn't know about that, so it wasn't classified until recently. So these things can happen. I think the silverback gorilla, or the Highland gorilla, no, it's not Highland, they're not Scottish. I think the large apes, they weren't documented until the turn of the century. So it's potentially big fucking animals that oh shit, where did that come from? We didn't know about. They exist in some sort of oral tradition or visual tradition with cave paintings and things like that, but they weren't classified by science, so they don't exist. And of course, this is the potential for a Bigfoot type of creature, is that it just has not been classified because it chooses not to be fucking caught. And fair play to it, man. If I could do that, I would. You know what I mean? If I could have a simple existence, I wasn't bothered all the time by people. I was just walking around, smelling the shit, scratching my nuts, and throwing rocks at strangers. I'd love the opportunity to do that, but I ain't smart enough. But there's a potential for that. So that's another area of myth that we could talk about for a long time. But I particularly am interested in the reasons that we have them, and I think a lot of it is to make sense of where we are, what we're about, where we're at, and where we're going. I think at some point we'll talk about fiction, and science fiction certainly does the same sort of thing, but projected, obviously, into the future, as our myths do of our history and our sense of where we've come from. So we'll cover that some other point. You know what I mean? Not going to do it all now. People have got places to be, things to see, places to go. So yeah, I hope you've enjoyed that. Sorry I waffled on a little bit at the end, and I apologise that I waffled on quite a bit in the middle as well, and the beginning. I apologise for all of it. Next week, I suppose I could either do it a day or so later, a day or so early. The Monday that I regularly do these on will be my eldest's 15th birthday. I know. You're thinking, how does he look so young when he's got a 15-year-old child? I exfoliate. I was in a place at 15 where my life sort of fucking fell apart for loads of different reasons. So I love this kid as well. Not just yeah, everyone says that about their children, but he's a fucking good lad. I've got nothing respect for him as a friend, as well as my eldest. So it's his 15th. He's got no other family. I really would want to make it something special for him, and just be with him really. So the chances of me doing it on Monday are next to zero. So I could do it the day before, day after, but I think perhaps it might be best for all of us if we just had a week off. We'll cross that bridge when we come to it. But if I'm not here next week, don't send out search parties. There is a really good reason for it, and yeah, I hope it's cool for him, and I hope whatever you're doing is cool as well. Okay, so remember to tell each other stories. They are important. Remember to listen to stories, because there's probably shit going on in them that you don't get first telling. Meta narratives. There's other things going on just beneath the surface, or implied but not explicit, that tell us a little bit more about where we are and what we're doing. All right, if you've got any ideas, let us know. I'll pretty much talk about any fucking thing, as you know. Any concerns, tell someone else. I don't give a fuck. Get in contact. I'm lonely. I'm really lonely. Somebody send me a message, just one, so I know you're still there and you still love me. No, it doesn't matter. Get in contact if you want. Don't get in contact if you want. Have a really good life, whatever it is you're doing. Take care, and if you don't take care, fucking blame somebody else for it. It's your own life. Take some responsibility. All right. God bless. See you all soon. Ta-da. Bye bye. See ya. Bye bye. Love you. Go on. Off you go.